93 WIBC, it is Terry Stacy. The Russian war on Ukraine has rekindled memories for Holocaust survivors all over the world. And joining us now is Karmela Waldman. She and her son Joel, an award-winning broadcast journalist, host a podcast called Surviving the Survivor. And Karmela, I am so grateful for this opportunity to talk to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
These images from Ukraine have triggered vivid memories for you too. So let's start with where you grew up.
I grew up on the border, exactly a border town between Hungary and what at the time I was born in 1939 was Yugoslavia.
Tell us about that knock on the door of your childhood home when you were just 5 years old.
We were in the ghetto. The Hungarian Nazis who joined the German Nazis were rounding us all up and taking us to the freight station to put us into freight trains to take us to Auschwitz. This was June 16, 1944, late in the war. Some places were even liberated then. And they took us, they stepped into the place where we were. We were 5 of us there, and my mother, when they were in a different room, she took me as if she were taking me out to go to maybe the bathroom, and she took me out through the back gate of the garden, and she started to walk with me. In other words, she just walked away from the people, and left there my grandmother, my father, and my grandfather in the house. And they were taken to the freight station where they were waiting for the trains to take them to Auschwitz. That's how I escaped.
You escaped, and did you have any idea at 5 years old what was happening?
You know, what I'm going to say is probably very strange, but I was the only grandchild of a lot of adults around me, and I was like a little bit like a little old lady, and I knew perfectly well that there was a very dangerous situation, and I knew I was Jewish. I already had an established identity at that time, at the age of 5, and I usually tell people, this I remember, I don't remember, and I just heard it secondhand from my mother. So I separate things that I heard and I didn't hear. The part of this day when my mother started to walk with me, I remember when they brought me to the nuns, Croatian eye doctor, who was a family friend, took us in and waited until nighttime so that nobody would recognize us, and then took me to the nuns. Because my mother was afraid of being recognized, because at this time it wasn't Yugoslavia anymore, it was Hungary, and there was a 2-hour train trip to Budapest that my mother took to hide. But she was afraid of the risks, and she preferred to leave me with the nuns.
And then your father and your grandparents, they all got on the train to Auschwitz.
This is a very, very complicated story, what happened to my grandmother, and I'm not going to go into that.
Okay.
But my grandfather and my father were gassed in Auschwitz.
Oh.
And I was with these nuns from June 16 until sometimes in December. When my mother began to miss me very badly in Budapest, and she asked somebody, and they accepted to take me up by train to her in Budapest. When I arrived to Budapest and was reunited with my mother, very shortly after, days after that, the bombardment of Budapest began. Oh. So this is where the similarities with the Ukraine come in. I remember some parts of this very vividly, and I'm not going to go into detail about what I remember, what I don't, but the fact is that we had a podcast with some people from the Ukraine who are now hiding in a laundry room in Kyiv. my son and I, of our podcast called Surviving the Survivor.
And this is Karmela Waldman, and she's talking about her podcast that she does with her son Joel, and it's called Surviving the Survivor. But these images that have been coming out of Ukraine have really triggered some vivid memories of her childhood when she was just 5 years old and she was separated from her parents as the Nazis invaded Europe. You're saying that there really are parallels between your experience and then the horror that is happening in Ukraine that the world is watching right now in real time. What feels familiar to you?
I have memories of hiding in Budapest because we were afraid that somebody who didn't like the Jews would denounce us to the police. So we were already hiding there. And on top of it, the siege of Budapest started in December. I never really looked at the hardcore data on this siege. But because of yesterday's podcast, I even Googled it. Turns out I never realized it was 50 days of the siege, of bombardment, of starvation, of sniper attacks, of shelling, of artillery. 50 days of that happened before the Nazis finally gave up. It took 50 days of heavy fighting around Budapest. The 7 bridges on the Danube were all blown up. There was no food. We were hiding in a basement. And the most interesting thing related to the Ukraine was that when I Googled it yesterday, I found out that the actual liberators who were from the Soviet Union and but the units that liberated Budapest were Ukrainian units because the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So it's like I was saying to myself, it's like really a full circle.
Yeah.
I cannot deal with the fact that in the 21st century, after what Europe went through in the 20th century, that these atrocities and war crimes are happening, attacking civilian residences and buildings and killing civilians. I was reading the statistics of what happened back in 1945 when Budapest was under siege, and how a very large percentage of the buildings were also destroyed in Budapest with the bombardments. And the time of the year was also February. Even the weather and the architecture of Eastern Europe, everything kind of brings it back to me.
I'm sure one of the conversations that we've been having is how will Ukraine ever recover from the devastation that we see, where everything is just demolished, things are gone, beautiful architecture, as you said, is gone, but it's lives that are most important, the lives that are gone. And we wonder, how will they ever recover? At 5 years old, and you going through all of what you went through, was there? We hear that once there that there were Holocaust survivors after the liberation, that you still weren't free, that survivors still weren't free because they had to go back to what was left, which was really nothing. And you talk about the hunger. So I see the 5-year-old you when I look at those 5-year-old faces that we see that have been fleeing Ukraine and that are now entering Poland. And I see I wonder, do they understand what's going on? Their father is now fighting for their country and left behind. And you wonder, don't you? You wonder what this does to them and will affect them for the rest of their lives, like it has you.
Somebody told me, by makeup, by nature, I'm an optimist. I believe that we can either become a cripples of what happens to us, or we can, quote, grow from it. And I think that hopefully all these children will have some understanding and fight against injustice. That's a very important thing to learn from this experience. But what it did to me psychologically, probably I don't even know the extent of the damage. But the other side of the coin is that I became a social worker. I have a master's in social work.
Oh, And you're living here in America. You're living here in Florida, right? You live in the United States now.
I am married to an American for about 61 years.
Oh,
my children were born in this country, and I just had my full life here. I'm out of Europe. But while there are many, many similarities, the bombardment, the fear, the running away as refugees, the only thing that it cannot be compared to the Holocaust, I am convinced that it cannot be compared to the Holocaust for the simple reason that now there are over 3 million refugees in the surrounding countries like Poland. And there are 1.5 million children who are now out of harm's way in the Ukraine and in Poland or Hungary or wherever they are. But unfortunately, sadly, and I'm sure the world knows that there were 1.5 million children, Jewish children, who were killed during the genocide in World War II. So the comparison stops there. Okay?
I'm glad that you said that, because there have been many that have compared the Holocaust to what we're seeing in Ukraine.
Since I was what they call now, first of all, most of the people who survived the Holocaust died from old age in the last 10 years. So the children survivors are still around. And we were hidden children. So the only analogy, the only comparison here is that we, as hidden children, we also lived through horrible bombardment, destruction. And turns out I personally lived through 50 days of the siege of Budapest, which I now learned from Google. And I would ask people to go on Wikipedia and see what happened in Budapest. And they will see that the history is repeating itself, because the same thing is now happening in the Ukraine. I mean, the senseless bombardment, the destruction of human life, which is incomprehensible. People try to understand why is this happening. It has to be related to some kind of a madness.
How young are you, Karmela?
I was born in 1939 in August. I will be 83. I'm 82.
I'm just so happy that you still continue to tell your story. I think it's so important, and I love the fact that you found a way to share your story and to talk to others about their stories through your podcast with your son Joel. The podcast is called Surviving the Survivor, and I want to make sure that everybody knows, Karmela, how they can find your podcast.
We have now what happened. Can I tell you in 2 words how did this happen?
Oh gosh, yeah, you can tell me in 8 words.
Okay. Well, what happened was we were stuck because of COVID, and my son said to me, "You know what? Let's start a podcast." and I said, "Well, what does it entail?" He says, "Every Wednesday we'll go to this place and we'll interview different people, and we'll talk about ourselves a little." And we started it with Spotify, and then we slowly went on YouTube, and now we have over 50 episodes.
Oh, that's great. Tell me about one of your favorite podcasts.
Week after week after week, interesting people, lesser known and very well known people. For example, one of the fascinating was Dr. Loeb, PhD in astrophysics, and he says that he saw something on one of his telescopes. Somebody else would have said that to me. I would have said, "Why don't you send them to a loony bin or something?" But he is convinced that we are getting messages from outer space, from other civilizations, and that this particular thing that he saw the phenomenon cannot be explained otherwise, etc., etc., etc. And so this was a fascinating one.
Yeah, I'm sure. Anything's possible.
I am a little bit skeptical of things. I have a hard time believing in what I see and what is concrete, but I think, because of his credential, he's the president of all sorts of professional associations, and he's a full professor at Harvard, and he's a very serious man.
Yeah.
And so I thought maybe there is something, and he going to look into it further. I have dozens that I can think of as fascinating. I didn't prepare, a list, but for example, I never watched the Tiger King series.
Oh, the Tiger King, yes.
Like something like 64 million Americans watched it. I missed that. And then we had her, Carol.
You talked to Carol.
Yeah, she was great. And we have, at least I would say out of the 50, 49 were interesting. It's like an education, I have to run it. I have to prepare for it. I don't, because I'm competitive. I don't want to sound like a complete idiot. So I learn all these new things. And we have a saying, we are all trying to survive in a rough world. So we are trying to survive. We are all survivors, every one of us. And we are trying to have both educational and entertaining ourselves. And then we have a very crazy relationship, my son and I.
Oh, I think that's wonderful that you do have that relationship and you have something to look forward to every week. And as you said, you're studying and you're learning, and everybody has a story, no matter where you come from. I have been doing this for 35 years and I get to have that opportunity. I was excited to talk to you, but there's those like you that you really can learn from. And I think you have to keep telling your story because it's a fascinating story of survival. And then you have this podcast, which is so great. When I looked at your credentials, it said Karmela Waldman is usually an atypical, hilarious, potty-mouthed marriage therapist turned shock jock on her podcast, Surviving the Survivor.
I don't know who wrote it, but it sounds better than the person. I am talking to Terry Stacy, right?
That's right.
Thanks for having me.
And we enjoyed you, Karmela. Thank you so much. You take good care of yourself.
Talk to you. Bye.
Bye.
You. Bye.
Bye.
You. Bye.